this is the correct screen?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay. Just tell me when to scroll, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so I will snip out the recording up to this point. Welcome, this is the Drupal Usability meeting for May 20th, 2022. I am Benji Fisher moderating. Also here are Thomas Howell, who's sharing his screen, Ralph Kohler, Aaron McHale, Antonia Offer-Schall, and Simo Helston. And Thomas, can you read out the issue number of the issue you're showing?
Sure, sorry, mute wouldn't come down. The issue number is, Zoom will get out of the way, 3085219, redesign installer. Problem motivation, recent interviews and research exposed pain points around Drupal's admin experience of looking and feeling dated. With Claro, the look and feel update to Drupal, the installer to adapt 7 designs to the new design system. The current look is as follows. There's an image that shows Sasha Eggenberger moving through an update. The proposed resolution is to redesign the installer and its components according to the new design system and implement it. Let me see if I can pop open the current state. This is the current state.
Okay, and I think Simo and Ralph have both looked at this issue before. Can we skip to the usability issues? Can either of you say what those are?
Proposed.
I could mention a few if you want.
Yeah, please.
There are several. The biggest point, in my humble opinion, is if you narrow down the browser window, then you get the steps, the current step in the upper right corner of the window unstyled. So you get just 2/6, for example. There's no context and nothing provided. For screen reader users, problematic, as well as for sighted users, unstyled and not really fitting in the visual representation of the installer theme right now. And as I already mentioned before, Laurie has made a comment that there is work about that step indicator for Claro. It's, I guess, in number 36. Oh no, in number 9 it was, sorry.
Thomas, can you zoom in a little bit? The installer is missing a steps component that could be reused outside of the installer. Work is underway here with link to Figma.
Yeah, because at the moment it isn't styled at all. And I made the suggestion also to change the title, that you start out with, for example, in the head title saying step 2 of 6 : and then the title of the current page, the pages currently. And Andy also suggested it would be reasonable also to add a hidden span, visually hidden span on the page. Also prefixing something like step 2 of 6, for example. Yeah, that is one of the issues. You also have to keep in mind the issue isn't only about the installer, that the design also affects updating the database, as well as one other context I'm blanking right now. The other thing Andy already fixed. It was about the grayish steps already passed. The other detail I'm still dislike. Okay. Yeah.
So one thing at a time.
Okay.
So graying out those steps, you've got to make sure the contrast is okay for accessibility, but what are the usability issues? So your comment about making clear what step of the process we're on, that sounds like usability issue. Is there still a problem there?
If I may add here, it hides information that's visible in desktop mode. So because there is no kind of an initial screen listing the steps. So with mobile device, you never know what the steps are called even. So kind of it just shows the numbers. So I was thinking that it would be extra click, but it might be beneficial to have something that says this is Drupal installation instead of starting from choose language title, and then would somehow explain what the steps are. But that would mean having extra click, which is also not good. But it kind of then it never says what the next step or previous step what they were. So it's kind of built on, like it puts a strain on memory to know what was happening and what is going to happen next.
So are there some screenshots we could look at showing it on narrow screens?
There isn't one yet. But it's basically at the moment, the current state is just, for example, a 2 and a slash and a 6 in the upper right corner in a bigger font size than the rest. But unfortunately, I don't have posted any, and no one else has yet.
So there are a bunch of screenshots in comment 49. And I guess, yeah, this one, for example, I guess that on a narrow screen, we see that first column, but instead of the navigation that we're currently looking at, we just see the 2 out of 6. Is that about right, Simo?
Yeah, so then we have 2 out of 6, and that very like that title is just on the on the main column on the main content, and there is no kind of a clue on what's going to be the next step. So that doesn't exist anywhere, I think.
So, okay, first question. It sounds like on the narrow screen, we hide too much information. How much do we want to show if we're on a narrow screen and we just don't have much space to work with? So Thomas, I think keep that screenshot, or I think that has the information that you see on a wider screen, and how much of this do we need to keep on a narrow screen?
Yeah, my idea was that if we could first give this information, and then it went in a first step, and then what the steps are, and then after that we would rely on memory. It's not so great, but at least the information would have been given.
So add an extra step to the process where we list basically what's in the right half of the screen here, saying what each of the steps are. And then on the later screens, just show the steps, the step number.
Yes, and that would also kind of add that also kind of solve that information, like missing information, that when you start that install.php, unless you know where you came from, you're not quite sure that it's a installation process, because the first title says it's like which version of Drupal is in the left-hand corner, and then there is only choose language. That's the page title. So it's not very. So if we had those steps, and if the first page title would be like Drupal installation, then that would also fix it starting from choose language. Sorry if I go on with this, but the first page being choose language is also a little bit problematic because it doesn't accurately describe what you are choosing. So if it's the installation process user interface language, or if it's the site language, and in fact it's both, and it's also the site default language. So it's kind of not 100% clear what you are doing in the first place, what you are choosing when you choose language.
Yeah, Thomas, could you scroll up to comment 31? I think that's an appropriate screenshot for what Simo was just talking about. So I think, Simo, you're now bringing up a second question, that it's not clear what the effects of this step are. It just says choose language. And you're saying that it's both the language that will be used during the installation process, and it's also going to become the site's default language.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's kind of a new issue, but it could be like it could be have a kind of a combined solution with the steps not showing.
Thomas, can you open that image in a separate tab? So getting back to the first question, we have these 6 steps, and then maybe it's just a question of design, but I suspect there's a way that you could have all 6 steps available on the page with just the current one initially visible. And I don't take my design suggestions too seriously, but one possibility would be to have a horizontal scroll or carousel sort of effect, where it initially loads and has in bold the current step. And then if you want to see what the other steps are, you can scroll horizontally. So that would basically take up one line of the narrow screen if you're looking at it on a small device. So that would argue in showing the same information on all screen sizes, which is generally a good principle for accessibility, to show the same information to everyone. And then it's just a design question of how to lay it out. Any opinions on that? Ralph, go ahead.
Not exactly related, but on the same page, there's another problem for non-native speakers. At the moment, the list items available are hard-coded and translated in a PHP file. But if you're an English speaker, then it's okay if you, for example, choose another language and you still understand the description underneath with translation will be downloaded from the Drupal translation website. But for example, if you have someone who doesn't understand, for example, English at all, and he or she wants to choose Deutsch, German, then if the rest of the interface copy remains English, it's the consequences aren't understood. They are understood at the point when save and continue is clicked. And from a multilingual perspective, I consider that also problematic. I also added that in the comment number 31, I guess. But it isn't in the scope of this issue, I suppose. It's more of a follow-up one, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I agree. That really sounds like a separate issue.
Yeah.
Whether or not we keep the design based on the 7 theme or the Claro theme, we have that problem. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thanks. I just want to echo that point. I think that's something that I'm not necessarily a multilingual person myself, but you know, we can so often if you know, people that only speak one language or a couple languages, if you think of like the installer and you're looking at it's English, and it's such an important point about making it work for right out of the box for someone who is you know, English isn't their native language, and you only have to look at what, you know, what other what different companies do. Like you look at things like Apple, Google, and Microsoft, like choosing language is the very first thing you do before you even get anything else on the screen. So I would definitely be interested in seeing if we can explore that further. I think definitely it's a separate issue, but it's something that is really important to explore. What is the very first, what should that very first interaction be, and what should it look like to ensure that you get an experience that you can understand?
I agree with that, but to get back to Benji's point, I like that what you've described, Benji. It actually sounds like what Aaron just said, a more Apple-like interface. So when you're going into your iPhone, I assume Android, but I don't have experience there, for the first time, rather than it being this list of tasks, each page is its own thing, and choose a language is a page. So that's kind of a working paradigm that anyone using a mobile or a pad-like device is going to be familiar with. And it allows you to make good use of what screen real estate you do have without changing the available information. I think outside of just the language, we might want to review what information is showing up on each of these pages to see if it makes sense in all contexts. But kind of using a horizontal view and looking at each point as its own page is a working paradigm.
Okay, and any other comments on that part of the problem, how to indicate the current step? Any other ideas on how to do it? Do people agree, disagree that we should have all the information available on the page? If anyone is trying to reply, you're all muted. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sort of thinking about how I'm thinking about the thing Thomas mentioned about, you know, the Apple interface and how each thing is a step, and we see that pattern quite often. Like we don't, what we're doing here is up front, you know, we have all the steps like 1 to 5. But in theory, actually, like sometimes like an install, like a more customized installer, like you might get in a distribution, could insert additional steps, or and additional steps could be arbitrarily added at different parts of the installation process. You might not actually know about those additional steps until you've made some kind of branching decision in the installer. So in some ways, well, I think it's good that we're upfront about how many steps there are. I think that in some ways is misleading, because on you know, on some of those forms, like on the language select, it's just one field, whereas on other forms there's lots of fields to fill in. So I don't feel like, part of me wants to say we're not adding any value by being like having the steps right there, because there's so many other variables at play here. But another part of me thinks that there is some value to, you know, having a sort of set of steps laid out, like, okay, you know, 1 to 5, these are the different elements. So I'm a bit conflicted on that, but I think there's probably a good case to say maybe we should just not, you know, the pattern these days seems to be from Apple, Microsoft, and Google, don't, you know, not to show steps like that. So maybe we should follow that in that way.
So you're actually arguing for less information on the page, that, you know, that we should tell people what the current step is, but we shouldn't tell them that it's 2 out of 6. Or we shouldn't tell them what the next step or the previous steps are.
I guess, but only in the sense that it might not be predictable, and I don't know how much value it's actually adding, because, as I said, like it might be the fact that, you know, on the configure site step, there's a lot of fields, whereas the choose language step has 1 field. Like, I'm just not sure that the amount of space that takes up and the amount of visual information there is there to parse, I'm just wondering if it's worth it even being there at all. And especially given the situation where that could start branching, like this might not be an accurate reflection on the number of steps that you end up with, because a distribution might decide, oh, we need some additional steps, but those might only show up if you take a certain course of action on a previous step.
Right. I guess step 2, choose profile, is where you'd make that decision.
Yeah, I guess that also wouldn't show up if you have a distribution. But again, there's a whole thing around distributions, maybe what the future of those are anyway. So
yeah, I still find it highly confusing for folks new to Drupal to differentiate between a profile and a distribution. And I think that's a separate issue entirely, but making certain that we focus on a more common pattern does make sense to me. And I don't think that we are losing, like, I can see at the end wanting to outline all of the steps that were followed to show someone, hey, this is like, I find it kind of disconnected how you skip from configure site, or don't skip, but you move from configure site, like all of a sudden you're going over into the site. I think that you could kind of give a, hey, this is all of the configuration that you just did. This is all the steps that you just ran through, but up front, it just, I don't know how necessary it is, because someone who knows Drupal, that's great. And someone who doesn't know Drupal, they're not even going to necessarily understand what each of these steps means or is indicating.
So I'm just pasting some links into the chat from the UK government design system. And this is how, if you wouldn't mind opening those, Thomas, because this is what I'm envisioning. This is a very well-established pattern, is this exact pattern of, in the first tab, you'll see a form there where each page is essentially what we're talking about. So each page has a field, and you then make a choice and you go next, and then you get another choice, but they don't like, you don't see the total number of steps because as you can see there may be some branching going on. So they can't clearly tell you up front, this is how many steps there are. And then you can see on the second link that I posted, you get this confirmation form at the end that shows you all of your answers that you've put in. So I think this is a pretty well-established pattern and has been extensively user tested and is very well researched. So I would suggest we actually look at, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, just taking these established patterns and using this kind of approach for the installer. That's essentially what I was getting at with my previous ramblings, so to speak.
And this is in line with what I was trying to describe. And I think to bring it back to the point at hand, this is why I like Benji's suggestion, because Benji's suggestion, the first thing that I thought of in my mind was something that looked just like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Ralph was giving a thumbs up to this approach too.
I have to be leaving shortly, if that's okay.
Okay. I can get another computer in a minute or two, unless someone else wants to take over screen sharing.
I'm happy to take over the screen share. I'm just I just need to move a couple of things around, so it just might take a second. I have too many desktops open right now and too many windows.
And we can discuss. I've got another like 2 minutes, but I just can't take forever. Was there anything else about this issue in particular that you wanted us to examine right now, Benji? Or do you find this to be the central point that we're discussing, that this issue from a usability perspective is really the question of how are we supposed to be progressing through these things in various contexts, such as a narrow, limited mobile device versus a larger area?
Okay, I can start sharing now. I think that it's another thing to mention actually, is like this pattern you can see right here works really well for small screens as well. The information on the screen is very clear and not cluttered.
So does that fit within the scope of this current issue? I think it actually might.
Well, the scope's pretty wide, it looks like, because it's like redesign installer. So it's according to the new design system. Like it's basically saying redesign it according to the new design system. And by that scope, it's like, well, if the new design system has this could have this pattern in it, then we could redesign the installer to use that pattern. I mean, we might end up spotting follow-up issues, but this seems to be the sort of meta, so to speak.
Yeah, if the parent issue is the roadmap to stabilize Claro, then that suggests that this issue is really about the visual design of the installer. Although, as you say, the title is very broad, just to redesign the installer. It could certainly be interpreted to include this. And I was also thinking about the order of the steps. And you made a really good point that the choice of language should be first and somehow has to be friendlier so that you're not using English to choose a different language.
Yeah, I'm wondering actually if they have a pattern on here for that. I suspect not, but perhaps there's somewhere.
And then sort of the other principle I was thinking of is that It's really frustrating if you go through a whole bunch of steps and finally get to one that is problematic and you have to abort. So it's sort of a good idea to exit as early as possible if there's going to be a problem. So I would hate to go through a bunch of complicated things in the first few steps and then get to the screen where I have to set up the database and say, oh, I need to ask my system administrator for what the database password is. I'm going to have to finish this later and start over from scratch. I mean, if the previous questions are all pretty simple, that's not a problem. But the order of the steps maybe we could reconsider.
Yeah, I think that's already the case, because you start with the language and then it takes you straight to the requirements, which is going to check the requirements, and at some point in that process you put the database information and then you go to the installation of modules. I think it's sort of amusing, because today I've been trying to install a Drupal distribution and I've been getting errors like near the end after it's already installed 100 modules. So I can relate to that sort of frustration of, well, I just spent 5 minutes and now I'm getting an error. But that's the kind of situation where we can't know ahead of time that's going to throw up an error.
I think that actually touches on an interesting thing as well. The way the UI is built today means that you can't change the behavior for each one of those tabs without impacting the overall flow visually of how you would go through each of those things. Whereas we might be able to have a more robust set of behaviors for more complex situations where we say, okay, you get to step 1 and it's going to behave in this way because we want, when you pick the language, the any other notes on that page to change to the language that you've chosen. And that's one behavior. Whereas maybe in step 3 or step 2, when you pick the profile, what you want to do is add in the fact that it's going to have additional steps. And it's not just the fact that you have branching situations, but there may be unforeseen situations in the future where at certain stages you actually want to change the total behavior of what's happening there, but still keep things looking visually consistent from page to page or from step to step.
Right. I think that it's quite similar to the point I was saying about how the being upfront about the number of steps might not be a good thing, because you can get that branching or you can get additional steps coming in.
Right. And the thing I was saying is it may not just be the number of steps, it may be what you want to do at each step. So for instance, with the distribution situation you just described, it may be necessary for certain distributions that they add in a pre-check, and then you press a button and it does a pre-check to see whether or not everything's available. And you would never want to have that kind of distinction under a normal circumstance. It might be disruptive to what's happening.
Yeah. Was there anything else on this that we wanted to raise? I mean, I feel like we've reached a natural kind of like conclusion in our discussion, but maybe there's something else that comes to mind. I think I have a site running that is stuck in the installation. Oh, it is. I can bring up an example of exactly what we were talking about. Just 1 second. I'm going to just clear out a site and I can
Yeah, we have a little less than 20 minutes left, so I don't know if there are other questions already on the issue that we'd like to bring up, either Ralph or Simo. Maybe you can point out some if they are, and then we have to decide, sort of summarize what our recommendations are, what are the next steps. So I guess some recommendations, some positive steps we've taken are, one, to look at the references Aaron gave us. And generally reconsider the order of the steps and whether we should follow those existing patterns. Second, we should reconsider whether the sort of navigation indication of what step we're on, whether we want to keep that or not. And then if we do want to keep it, then we probably want to make the same information available on all screens, although the design will change.
Yeah, so here's an example of the open social distribution, which inserts a step here that's not there normally, which is the select optional modules. And I should be able to jump straight to that step. So this is another interesting side effect. If you pass all the requirements and your database connection's already set up, it will take you straight to in this case, the select optional modules, but normally it'll take you straight to the install step. So for a user, they might think, wait, did I just skip a whole bunch of steps, or is there something weird going on here? If they're unfamiliar with what is going on. But you could see this is something Open Social does, where it gives you this list of modules you can install before as optionals before you can go to the install site step. And I mean, this isn't particularly an example of branching, but in theory, because distributions as they are right now can insert any number of arbitrary steps. So I said earlier, you could have a distribution that starts inserting more and more steps further down the process.
Okay. So that's an argument for not showing the information because we can't be sure it's accurate.
Yeah.
Ralph, I see you posted a link in the chat. Would you like to talk about that?
Yep. And just brief addition to Aaron's point, it's also the case, for example, if you install a site with DDEV locally, there's also the direct jump to the install step, for example. So it's definitely a point for perhaps removing or rephrasing the list of steps or present it in a different way. And yeah, the other probably bigger issue, but it's a bit accessibility, mainly accessibility related, because it's for screen readers. But in the installer, you have also the step where you create your admin user, and there you set the password for the admin user. And it's the same like on the user profile when you change the password. As soon as you type the first character, underneath the second field for the confirmation of the password, you get a widget showing the requirements for the password. And for a screen reader, that is completely invisible because it isn't announced, nor any notifications that there is some sort of pointer. And that's an issue I've created a few weeks ago when I've noticed that. And it definitely affects the installer as well.
Yeah, so for the record, that's an issue I have open right now, which is 327 2325.
Right.
Yeah, I think this looks like it's clearly an accessibility issue.
Okay. I suppose that wouldn't affect the database password. That specifically is talking about the requirements for passwords, which we don't have anything for the database password. This is just the user password.
I think that's correct.
Okay. So do we have a consensus on whether to include the list of steps or not?
I think the steps, yeah, it's better not to have the steps as long as the flow of things is kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I guess like a way to sum that up is that if we're asked to provide, usability input on something, and we look at something like this, which is a very well established, well researched, pattern for how you do these multi-step forms, which is essentially what this is, in a way that's accessible to mobile and desktop and things, then what we should be doing is recommending those existing patterns. So that would mean, recommending we take an approach like this, which, as we said before, facilitates the behavior you might see in distributions of, branching steps or additional steps. It makes it easier for those to be accommodated.
Okay, do people disagree, agree? You can give a thumbs up or put something in the chat if you'd like. Ralph gives a thumbs up. Offer, Antonia, I'm not sure I have an opinion. Ralph, Offer, and Simo all give thumbs up. So that's a pretty good consensus. Okay, so that's, we can give a strong recommendation on that and a link to this resource.
Also,
another links in Slack as well.
Also, another thing with removing numbered steps is that it kind of helps not having kind of what's the word, obsolete or deprecate, obsolete documentation or obsolete guides somewhere that refer to number in step 1 do this, in step 3 do this. So that's kind of, if the steps are not numbered, then it kind of helps keeping that documentation up to date if the kind of the actual form doesn't change, like the fields don't change on the order or something like that.
Okay, great. I guess I don't have a strong opinion on that either way, but that's okay. The group has a consensus. Other recommendations we can give? And again, although the title of this is very broad, I think this issue is intended to talk about the visual design. So I think this might be a new issue to change the information, but that will inform this issue, that we should not be worrying too much about displaying where we are in the process, because the larger plan is to remove that information from the installer. So I think it might be a good idea to open a new issue and add a comment here linking to that one. Aaron, do you think you'd like to do that? Do you have time?
Yeah, I could probably do that. And I don't know, Ralph, are you happy to open the issue about sort of where we'd have a space to look at the multi-language or selecting language, like that particular text. I think that probably deserves its own issue.
You mean to have an automatic switching translation on the first page if you switch to, for example, German?
Yeah, or I mean, that could be one solution. Like, I'm just thinking, like, if we have an issue, at least we have a space to discuss what the problem and propose different solutions.
Okay.
Because I could see another approach would be just simply have a list of languages and you click on your language and then that takes you to the next step rather than having a separate like next button kind of thing. I'm just thinking aloud here. So there could be different ways to approach that problem space.
But if you don't have a button, for example, and let's say you switch to French and you don't speak French by accident, and then you get automatically forwarded to the next page, which is completely in French, and then you're even more lost than you were before. So that, I think, might be problematic.
That's a good point, actually. Okay. Yeah, it's a fair point.
One thing I thought about, we had a discussion before about multilingual things and icons. And I thought maybe if we add something about these languages, I recently had a page. By mistake, I used that Google Translate built in on the site to a different language I'm not familiar with. And then it was really difficult to go back to English because everything, including the dropdown, was translated to that language of letters I'm not familiar with. So I thought having at least an icon that showed this is what it does, if we figured out what that international symbol would be, might help people know this is where you change language when these characters are not familiar.
Yeah, I think a couple of months ago, we talked about icons for the language switcher.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some suggestions there. I don't think we've come up with a definitive answer yet. I also see that Ralph posted another link in the chat. Maybe Aaron, you could open that up. And
yep.
This is another research group has recommendations for step-by-step processes like this, which are often called wizards.
Okay, so they have, so I guess, are they suggesting a similar approach of you have these different, a stepped approach?
Just scanning through the page, it looks to me more like examples than a prescription. They have some guidelines at the bottom, but it does, just from scanning the page, doesn't look as explicit as the UK recommendations that you were showing us earlier.
Yeah, I think because the ones from earlier are part of the wider gov.uk design system, so they make specific recommendations about for when this is the kind of pattern you use for government services, but they do point to the research that they've done around this and the research that supports it.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left. I think, Aaron, you've agreed to create an issue talking about that point, and Ralph will add an issue about making the initial page more friendly to people who don't speak English. And we'll link to those. Anything else? Tony,
I think
leaving, wishes us all a great weekend, and Ralph too.
No, I'm just
Okay.
in reply to Antonia. Just.
Yeah. So if I'll happy to create that issue, then and Ralph, if you're to create the other one, and then maybe we could just comment in Slack when we've created those, and then that way we can just you know, I'm happy to post a comment, or Benji or Ralph, if either of you want to, on this issue, just to summarize everything and point to those two issues. Then we could probably, yeah, if we coordinate in Slack, that probably is the easiest way, I would think.
And shall I make the multilingual issue a child issue of yours, Aaron?
I would suggest they both be childs of this one, because I think the two issues we're creating are about specific parts of the problem, and this is the overall kind of issue. That would be my recommendation.
Good choice. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all, and I'll be back next week. Hope you can make it too.
Oh, I might not be here next week because I'm going to Portugal for a wedding.
Oh,
so
enjoy yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a wedding that was supposed to happen in 2020, so it's about time. But yes. Thank you.
Cool. Enjoy the wedding and have a nice weekend.
Yeah, bye.